hoarseness of voice today. Some of the iconic movie dialogues were delivered in hoarse voice, yet hoarseness provides a lot of mortality for the sufferer. So I'll be talking about what is hoarseness, briefly touching the anatomy of the larynx, the vagus nerve and its branches, what are the signs of vocal cord palsy, and then we'll discuss the pathologies. So what is hoarseness of voice? It is a voice that sounds breathy, strained, rough. It can be of high pitch or of low pitch. So when a patient comes with hoarseness, a detailed history is required, physical examination, and then the patient is worked up. If the hoarseness persists for more than 4 weeks, then a laryngoscopy should be done to look for the local cause. And if there is no local cause, then an imaging should be done. So let's look at the anatomy of larynx. So this diagram shows that's the thyroid cartilage, the true vocal cords, the arytenoid cartilage is behind, and this is the cricoid. So this is a coronal section of the larynx. So what you see is on the top, first this is the paralaryngeal fat and medial part is the false vocal cord. That's how you see it on the coronal section. Then you have the laryngeal ventricle, which is filled with air, and below that you have the true vocal cords, which is formed by the thyroarytenoid muscles and the vocalis muscles medially. So that's the thyroid cartilage. How do you recognize the thyroid cartilage on a CT? It is reverse V-shaped. Posteriorly is the cricoid, and on the top of that is the arytenoid cartilages. Usually this is the cricoarytenoid joint, and the arytenoid cartilages are slightly medial in a normal patient, oblique in a normal patient. So this forms the laryngeal ventricular complex, the false cord, then you have the laryngeal ventricle, and below that you have the true vocal cord. The same thing, that's how you see on an MRI, the false cord, then you have the laryngeal ventricle, and that's the true cord. So what forms the supraglottis? You have the epiglottis, the periepiglottic folds, the vocal cord, false vocal cord, and then you have the ventricle. These are all the parts of the supraglottis. Then you have laryngeal ventricle here. Then below that you have the glottis, almost 5 millimeter inside in superior inferior dimensions, and below that you have the subglottis. So how do you image larynx? When imaging of the larynx is always done in quiet breathing. Why in quiet breathing? Because the vocal cords are abducted in this position. They're open. So if there is a lesion there, you can easily pick up when the vocal cords are abducted. On what happens in phonation? When phonation is done by asking the patient to say E, so that is adduction. So the vocal cords come medially. So this is called phonation. This is to check the movement of the vocal cords, the true vocal cords. And what happens when you ask the patient to hold a breath? In this, the vocal cords are opposed, the glottis is opposed. So whenever you are imaging a patient for a neck pathology, you never ask the patient to hold the breath, because either it can mimic a mass or you can miss out lesions, because vocal cords are quite opposed when you ask the patient to hold a breath. So usually this is done in CT chest when you ask the patient. So a neck CT is never done in breath hold. So quiet breathing, and then if you are suspecting a vocal cord, if you are imaging larynx, then you do a phonation maneuver. That is, you ask the patient to say E, in which the vocal cords adduct. So that's the brief anatomy of the larynx, and how do you image the patient on a CT scan when you are doing analyzing a laryngeal pathology. Now let's move on to the nerves, the vagus nerves. So vagus nerve has nuclei in the medulla. Then it has a cisternal segment. It goes into the jugular fossa. From jugular fossa, then it travels in the neck. So you have to see whole of the course of the nerve when you are imaging it. So let's briefly see the nerves. So the vagus nerve has nuclei in the upper as well as in the mid medulla. So this is a section at the level of the brainstem at the level of upper medulla. So what do you see in medulla? Medulla, I'll just briefly tell. So that's the midline. The first bump you see, that is the pyramid. Then posterior to that is the pre-olivary sulcus. The second bump is the olive. And then you have the post-olivary sulcus. So pyramids, which are the projections. Then you have a small dip, that is the pre-olivary sulcus. Then a bump, which is the olivary nucleus. And that's the post-olivary sulcus. So where are the nuclei of the cranial nerve 10th or the vagus present? So here are the nuclei, nucleus ambiguus and multiple more nuclei. They are in the posterolateral part of the upper and mid medulla. Again, these are the pyramids, the pre-olivary sulcus, olive, and that's the post-olivary sulcus. And here are the nuclei on the left side as well on the right side here. Then the nerve arises from the post-olivary sulcus. So these are 9th, 10th, and 11th all together from the post-olivary sulcus. So this is the cisternal segment of the nerve. Again, a section at the level of upper and mid medulla. These are showing the cisternal segments. So this is the oblique sagittal. This is a cis or a space or a fiesta sequence, which is a heavily weighted T2 sequence, heavily weighted sequence, which we do for imaging of the cranial nerves. So oblique reformatted. So this is the 7th, 8th nerve, which is going into the internal auditory canal. And below that, you have the 9th, 10th, and upper spinal segments of the 11th nerve. So these are together, and then they go towards the jugular foramen. So this is a CT at the level of jugular pulp or the jugular foramen. I'll just briefly tell you the anatomy. So this is the jugular foramen. It has two parts. This whole thing is the jugular. It has two parts, anterior and a larger posterior, which are separated by jugular spine. So anterior part is called pars nervosa and posterior is pars vascularis. Internal auditory internal carotid artery is just anterior to it. So anterior part nervosa and pars vascularis. So way to remember is the 9th nerve goes through pars nervosa. So remember N for the 9th nerve. So in the nervosa, pars vascularis, in pars vascularis, the 10th nerve, which is the vagus. So V for vascularis and V for vagus. That's how you can remember it. So they go into the jugular fossa and then exit the jugular fossa and go into the upper neck. So the extracranial segment, then they travel the 9th, 10th and 11th nerve, they travel in the carotid space, nasopharyngeal carotid space, and continue down in the carotid space and into the thorax. And the 10th nerve is on the posterolateral aspect of the IAC. So that's the IJV. This is the carotid, internal carotid artery. Then you have the vagus nerve, the accessory nerve, as well as the 9th nerve. So these are all just posterior. These vagus nerve is just posterior to it. So that's how that's the course. So that's the section, axial section of the CT at the level of upper neck. So that's these are the carotid spaces. So here the vagus nerve is along the posterior aspect of the carotid. As you go down, again along the carotid vessels, it travels in the carotid space on the posterior to the carotid vessels. another section lower down again along the carotid space. So that's how, and then it goes into the thorax and deep down. So that's the course of the vagus nerve in the neck. Then you have to look at the branches. So it has auricular branch, the pharyngeal branch, the superior laryngeal, and the recurrent laryngeal. So these are important. Recurrent laryngeal nerve is the most important when you're dealing with vagal nerve palsy. So along with the vagus, you have to know the course of these nerves. So first, let's see what is superior laryngeal. So here is the vagus. It exits the jugular fossa. It travels in the neck, straight down inferiorly along in the carotid space. So it gives a pharyngeal plexus branch to the constrictors. Then it gives superior laryngeal branch, which supplies the cricothyroid muscle. And then later on, it travels down and then gives the recurrent laryngeal branch, which supply most of the larynx. So the pharyngeal plexus and the superior laryngeal nerve arise from the superior part of the nerve. So this is very important, whereas recurrent is from lower down. So superior laryngeal nerve supplies the cricothyroid muscle, the pharyngeal constrictors, and the pharyngeal plexus supplies the pharyngeal constrictors, uvula, and the palate. So these are branches from the proximal part of the vagus nerve. You have to remember it is important. Why? Because if the damage of the vagus nerve is in the proximal part, it will lead to pharyngeal constrictor atrophy. It will cause palatal drop, and the uvula will be deviated to the contralateral side. This is very important. So to see, so if there is a high vagal nerve palsy, so you will have pharyngeal constrictor atrophy, palatal drop, and contralateral deviation of the uvula to the opposite side of the vagal palsy. So after the superior laryngeal, let's move on to the most important branch, which is the recurrent laryngeal. So we came right from the jugular fossa. So first the brainstem, then we had the cisternal segment, then the jugular fossa, then the vagus nerve traveled all along in the neck, in the carotid space, posterior to the carotid vessels, and then it gives recurrent laryngeal nerve branches. But the right is different from the left. The right one is shorter, whereas the left recurrent laryngeal nerve is much longer. So the vagus nerve comes and then it turns around and gives around the brachiocephalic artery. Then it gives recurrent laryngeal nerve, which ascends up in the neck. This is on the right side. Whereas on the left side, that's the vagus nerves. It travels down, goes all around the arch, and then gives recurrent laryngeal nerve, which then travels up to the larynx. So you can see the right one is shorter, whereas the left one has a much longer course. So that is when you are imaging a patient of vagal nerve palsy, you have to go right up to below the arch of aorta. That means you have to include the upper mediastinum to look for the cause of vagal nerve palsy or vocal cord palsy. So that's the right side at the cervicothoracic junction. It passes posteriorly around the subclavian artery. The right side is recurrent laryngeal nerve is 5 to 6 centimeter in length, whereas on the left side, it goes under the aorta, and then it is much longer, 11 to 12 centimeter in ISO. Since it is much longer, so the injury on the left side is much more commoner than on the right side because it has a longer course. Then once the recurrent laryngeal nerves have originated, then they ascend up in the neck, back in the neck. So then they go towards the tracheoesophageal groove. So that's the vagus nerves, which comes down in along the carotid space, whereas these are the recurrent laryngeal nerves which ascend up into the tracheoesophageal groove. Then go more superiorly, they pass behind the cricothyroid joint, and then they supply the larynx. So all the muscles, intrinsic muscles of the larynx are supplied by a recurrent laryngeal nerve, except for cricothyroid, which I told you before, is supplied by the superior laryngeal nerve. So there is one anatomical variant. Whenever you have an aberrant right subclavian artery, so it is associated with non-recurrent inferior laryngeal nerve. That is, here, if you have retroesophageal aberrant right recurrent laryngeal nerve, then, aberrant right subclavian artery on the right side, then the recurrent laryngeal nerve will not go around the subclavian artery. It will be a branch of the vagus in the neck itself. So that is a non-recurrent inferior laryngeal nerve. So whenever you are looking at an aberrant right subclavian artery, when you are reporting it and the patient has to go for any neck surgery, you must tell the surgeon that this is associated with non-recurrent inferior laryngeal nerve, and because it can cause injuries during surgery if it is not mentioned in the report. Or not, you can't mention, but not communicated to the surgeon. So it can cause iatrogenic injuries during surgeries. Along with the vagus nerve, you can see there are two accessory nerves. There are two nerves, the 9th and the 11th, which is the accessory nerve, which you see in the suprahyoid neck, which also travel in the jugular fossa along with the vagus nerve. Then the 11th nerve, the bulbar portion travels with the vagus nerve to supply the larynx and the pharynx. Then it has a spinal portion which innervates the sternocleidomastoid and the trapezius muscle. So we have seen the anatomy of the larynx. We have seen the anatomy of the vagus nerve, its branches. Now let's move on to vocal cord palsy. So vocal cord, as we've already told, it's supplied by recurrent laryngeal nerve, except for cricothyroid, which is a branch of superior laryngeal nerve. So whenever you are imaging the patient with vocal cord palsy, either it can be because of the recurrent laryngeal nerve or the vagus neuropathy. So you have to image both. So your imaging should be from so it is important to know whether it is a proximal or a distal, and imaging should be done from the neck up to the superior mediastinum. So it can be either in the medulla, cisternal segment, jugular fossa, or in the neck. It can be idiopathic. The causes can be traumatic, it can be neoplastic, or you can have a thoracic cause. Let's look at how do you recognize vocal cord palsy on an imaging CT or MRI. How does it look? So this is a coronal section in normal breathing at the level of larynx. We've seen the anatomy. So this is the paralaryngeal fat, the false vocal cord, then this is the laryngeal ventricle, and this is the true vocal cord. What do you see in a normal phase? So normally, the laryngeal ventricle is not that dilated. This right vocal cord is in normal breathing is nice and abducted, whereas on the paralyzed side, it is thin and medially pointing. Because it is thin and medially pointing, the laryngeal ventricle is dilated. On a normal breathing, on a resting phase, the vocal cord normally should not point medially. So when we ask the patient to do E maneuver or the phonation, the normal vocal cord adducts whereas the paralyzed vocal cord stays the same way. So there is a palsy on the left side. So pointing of an atrophied cord and inability to abduct is a sign of vocal cord palsy. The laryngeal ventricle dilates because of atrophied cord. That's the coronals image. There are other signs, multiple signs. This is the axial CT through the larynx. Here, what do you see? The paramedian medial position of the true vocal cord. Why does this happen? Because in vocal cord palsy, there will be paralysis of the cricoarytenoid muscle. So what happens when the cricoarytenoid muscle is the main abductor of the cord? So if that gets paralyzed, the vocal cord cannot go abduct or go laterally. So paramedian position of the vocal cord in normal breathing when you image the patient is a sign of vocal cord palsy. This is how you see on the axial. This is the dilated laryngeal ventricle. So when the posterior cricoarytenoid muscle atrophies, what happens is, this is the normal position of the arytenoid, slightly oblique. This arytenoid cartilage on the paralyzed side will be anteromedially displaced. The first sign we saw dilated ventricle, inability to abduct the cord. Then you see the arytenoid cartilage on the side of palsy will be anteromedially displaced because you have atrophy of the posterior cricoarytenoid muscle. You will see dilated on the axial, dilated laryngeal ventricle, medialization of the posterior part of the vocal cord and the arytenoid cartilage. So this resembles a sail, a ship sail. So that's called the sail sign. So that's the ventricle, and that's how it looks. The vocal cord looks. That's called the sail sign. These were the direct sign. There are certain indirect sign, and most of the patient you don't see all the signs. You can look for the indirect signs. That is enlarged pyriform sinus. If you compare both the pyriform sinuses, the left side pyriform sinus is enlarged compared to the right side. So this is an indirect sign, and you will have medially positioned area-epiglottic fold. If you see here, the right pyriform sinus is less distended compared to the left side. The area-epiglottic folds on the disease side or on the affected side is more medially placed. And sometimes you see the CT when you get is in the non-standard position. That is, it is not parallel to the vocal cord when the images. So it gives an appearance of a mushroom, and that's called the mushroom sign. Because many times you'll get patients or the images like these, which are not parallel to the vocal cord, which have not been reconstructed parallel to the vocal cord, or C5-6 level, disc level, which is usually done in laryngeal imaging. So you'll get this mushroom sign. So medialized true vocal cord with dilated ventricle anteriorly. There's another sign which is called the subglottic arch. Sign is lost. So this is just to show you what is a subglottic arch. Nice. So in a normal patient, this is the normal subglottic arch. That's the shape of the normal subglottic arch on resting, and this is on the phonation, whereas the subglottic arch is lost. The nice convexity seen in the normal patient is lost in this. So this is the loss of subglottic arch. This is another sign of vocal cord palsy. Just these are the volume rendering technique images. Same patient with left vocal cord palsy. We'll just quickly revise. So enlarged pyriform sinus, medially positioned area-epiglottic fold. Then you have dilated laryngeal ventricle, medially positioned true vocal cord, unchanged on phonation, and then you have loss of subglottic arch. So we're done with the signs on a CT. Similarly, on MR also, you will see enlarged piriform sinus, radially positioned right epiglottic fold. Here the vocal cord palsy is on the left side, and you will get initially edema-like signal in the affected vocal cord. Why? Because these are in acute phase, you will see signs of denervation edema. Later on, the vocal cord will atrophy. So this can mimic a tumor. So it is important to know this sign, that is in acute denervation, the vocal cord will show hyperintense signal on STIR and T2. So I told you before that vagus nerve has two important branches, which one is the pharyngeal and superior laryngeal branch, which arise from the superior part of the vagus nerve. So if the superior part of the vagus nerve is affected, so if the pharyngeal branches are affected, so that side there'll be atrophy of the constrictor muscles. So if you see nice bulk on the left side, on the affected side, they will atrophy. So if you see these signs, so that means there is a high vagal nerve palsy. You will have deviation of the uvula also to the opposite side, and tilting of the thyroid cartilage because of the cricothyroid atrophy as well. An important thing is, since the 11th nerve also travels along with the 10th nerve in the suprahyoid neck, you will see atrophy of the sternocleidomastoid muscle. If you compare the bulk of the sternocleidomastoid on the right and the right side is definitely atrophied. So these are all denervation, edema, and the trapezius muscle also atrophies. So that means if you see these with constrictor atrophy, that means the lesion is higher up. And in these patients, sometimes you see because of the atrophy of the sternocleidomastoid and the trapezius, there will be compensatory hypertrophy of the levator scapulae muscle. Ninth nerve neuropathy will show asymmetric bulk at the level of torus tuberous and the pharyngeal constrictors, and the contralateral uveal deviation with palatal drop on the same side. So we have seen the anatomy of the larynx and of the lower cranial nerves. We have seen the signs of vocal cord palsy. Let's move on to some of the examples. So in many, 50% of the cases, vocal cord palsy is idiopathic and you don't see any cause. They can be iatrogenic. It can be because of some neoplasms, which can be benign as well as malignant. Then lesions involving the medulla. You can have infections, trauma, idiopathic, or any toxicity. So for imaging, I've divided the imaging a patient with vocal cord palsy into brainstem lesion, jugular fossa, depending upon which space is involved, the carotid, the tracheoesophageal groove, larynx, or of the mediastem. So you do a CT. It is important either you go parallel to the vocal cord or parallel to C5-6 disc space when you are imaging. So this is how you do a laryngeal imaging or reconstruct the axials parallel to C5-6 disc space, which will produce imaging parallel to the true vocal cord. Then you go from the skull base right up to the superior mediastinum. But if you are suspecting a higher vagal nerve palsy that is involved in the skull base, you do an MRI. PET is very sensitive to rule out malignancy. So let's look at some of the examples of brainstem lesion. So a patient came with difficulty in swallowing, with hoarseness. You see an area of restricted diffusion in the posterolateral part of the medulla. So that's the lateral medullary infarct, and clinically the patient will present with Wallenberg syndrome. It is because of the occlusion of vertebral artery, or pica. Patient comes with dysarthria, hoarseness, etc. Another case, smaller infarct on the left side, very faintly seen on the FLAIR sequence. It came with slurring of speech and hoarseness of voice. So this is the previous two lesions were involving the nuclei of the vagus nerve. Then this next patient is again came with slight change of voice, but normal on laryngoscopy. What do you see? There is a lesion in the cisternal segments of 9th to 11th cranial nerves, which are very difficult to differentiate and enhancing. So that's just a small schwannoma sitting there. Another larger lesion in the right cerebellomedullary system, which is also, and CP angle system, which is also compressing the lower cranial nerves and with a lot of hemorrhage. So this is a larger schwannoma. This is biopsy proven. You can have other lesions like a meningioma, which is involving the CP angle or cerebellomedullary system, which can compress the lower cranial nerves. So that's an example of a meningioma. It is compressing the left half of the medulla. You can have infections, you can have other metastasis involving the cisternal segments of the nerves. While I was collecting the cases for hoarseness, this patient came day before yesterday. There's a this patient came with hoarseness of voice. There's a large lesion just beneath the tectorial membrane, so which is compressing the medulla. So any lesion, extrinsic lesion compressing the medulla can cause hoarseness of voice. Next case is a 54-year-old male who came with difficulty in swallowing and hoarseness of voice. So what do you see in this? There is denervation atrophy. The right half of the tongue is atrophic. It is showing fatty change and it is posteriorly bulging into the vallicula. Then you see, so these are all denervation changes of the 12th nerve. What you see, the laryngeal ventricle on the right side is dilated with medially positioned right vocal cord. So that's the 10th nerve. Then you see atrophy of the right sternocleidomastoid compared to the left side. So that is the 11th nerve. Denervation changes. You can also appreciate on the axial, the right sternocleidomastoid is not seen if you compare it with the left side. So where should you look for the lesion? You have atrophy of the 9th, of the 10th, you have atrophy of the 11th, you have atrophy of the 12th now. Let me see, you can put it in the chat boxes. Where will you look for the lesion? Okay, so that means the lesion is higher up. It's somewhere in the jugular fossa. So this lesion, it showed a large expansile lesion in the right jugular fossa. It is intensely enhancing. The jugular fossa is expanded. There is no erosion. So that was a case of a schwannoma, a dumbbell-shaped lesion with smooth enlargement of the jugular fossa, homogeneous enhancement. And on MRI, I can't see any fluids within the lesion. So that's a schwannoma. So whenever you have a lesion in the jugular fossa, all the three nerves are affected. Patient will come with, that's called the Wernicke syndrome. The patient will come with otalgia, dysphagia, and changes in taste in the posterior thirds of the tongue. Another lesion, large lesion in the jugular fossa, central, is non-enhancing or there's a cystic change, expansion of the jugular fossa, another case of a schwannoma. The next case is a case with patient came with pulsatile tenessus right side, large expansile lesion in the jugular fossa, but you see a lot of, it is very vascular. You see irregular vessels within it. That's the salt and pepper appearance. It's in the jugular fossa going into the middle ear. So that is a glomus tumor in the right jugular fossa. There is these are the CT findings. It is causing irregular erosion of the jugular fossa. So that's a glomus jugular or jugular tympanica. This causes erosion of the jugular fossa and in early cases jugular spine, whereas schwannoma causes expansion of the jugular fossa. Another companion case with flow voids within it in the jugular intensely enhancing the smaller jugular fossa lesion. In these glomus jugular, and you have to be aware of jugular pseudo-lesions. Sometimes prominent jugular bulb can mimic a lesion, give contrast, and look for its homogeneous enhancement, look for high jugular bulbs, or sometimes dehiscent jugular bulb, which can mimic a lesion. So you have to carefully look at these lesions in the jugular fossa. Next case, a 76-year-old male came with hoarseness of voice. So which side is abnormal? Now you all know. The left side is abnormal because this is the normal resting phase, normal respiration. The laryngeal ventricle on the left side is enlarged, unchanged on phonation. So you look for the lesion in the left side. So there's a lesion in the left jugular fossa. This was a known case of malignancy. So that is the metastasis in the jugular bulb, and it is causing erosion of the jugular fossa. Let's move on to the carotid space. Again, carotid space has supra-hyoid neck, where you'll have all the three nerves, the 9th, the 10th, and the 11th, whereas infra-hyoid neck, it's only the vagus nerves which travels. So a large lesion in the left upper neck, it is mild heterogeneously enhancing. It is causing anteromedial displacement of the carotid vessels and posterolateral deviation of the IJV. So this is a case of a schwannoma, vagal schwannoma. Whereas if a lesion in the carotid space shows flow voids, which enhances intensely, causes splaying of the external and internal carotid vessels, becomes a glomus tumor. So so these lesions can compress the vagus nerve since it is in the same space. Vagus nerve is posterior to the carotid vessels, and it causes splaying of the ECA and ICA. You can have necrotic ill-defined lesions, also like nodes in the carotid space, which can involve the nerves, the vagus, the 12th nerve. Here you can see denervation, atrophy of the left half of the tongue, which is falling posteriorly. Whenever you see denervation, atrophy of the 12th nerve, you will see a very sharp medial margin, which will not cross the midline. If it was a tumor, it would have some irregular shape, and this is how you differentiate. And this also patient had vagal nerve palsy, so this was a large necrotic node causing the palsy of these nerves. Then you can have dissections of the carotid vessels, which can, when the vessel will be enlarged. On T1, you see T1 hyperintense signal in its human. So that's the thrombosed part, and which is causing infarcts on the left side. This is a case of dissection that can also cause the palsy. So you have to systematically see all the spaces where the vagus nerve travels to look for the cause of vagal nerve palsy. Then you go on to the tracheoesophageal groove right behind the thyroid glands. So the lesions which can involve are, again, patient came with vocal cord palsy on the right side. There's a lesion sitting posterior to the thyroid gland. So that's a parathyroid lesion, which is compressing the recurrent laryngeal nerve, which travels in this region and causing this palsy. Another case of left-sided vocal cord palsy. The left piriform is enlarged, medially positioned left true vocal cord. So there is a large lesion arising from left lobe of thyroid, which is extending into the tracheoesophageal groove and also compressing the trachea towards the right side. That's a malignant thyroid lesion. So what is important is if a thyroid lesion comes with palsy, it is mostly a malignant hoarseness in a thyroid disease, mostly associated with malignancies. The colloid nodules or the benign lesions usually do not cause palsy. You can have carcinoma esophagus lesions with nodes in the tracheoesophageal groove, which can cause palsy. So next case is a 67-year-old male with hoarseness of voice. So what do you see in this? Which side is abnormal? You have enlarged right pyriform sinus, medially positioned aryepiglottic fold. Is it right or is it left? So this is not a case of palsy. There is the soft tissue thickening in the region of right true as well as vocal cord with effacement of the right paraglottic fat. So this is a case of a carcinoma. So that's the local cause of the larynx, which looks like, which is not palsy, but it is malignancy of the larynx. So this is a case of a transglottic carcinoma. So these are laryngeal lesions which will cause a glottic CA involving the right side of the vocal cord, reaching up to the anterior commissure, mildly enhancing. That's how you see it on the coronal. Right side vocal cord is bulky, it is enhancing. Biopsy reveals squamous cell carcinoma. So that's the vocal cord palsy. So if the lesion is in the glottis, it presents early with vocal cord palsy rather than a subglottic region, which are usually silent and present later on with change of voice or dysphagia depending upon how it is extending. So this is a subglottic carcinoma extending posteriorly and abutting the esophagus. PET images showing increased uptake in these areas. So we are done with the so some of the benign causes like polypoidal lesions or the polyps, which also can present with vocal cord palsy, small laryngeal nodule, patients with trauma, with fractures of the laryngeal cartilages presenting with vocal cord palsy. Or you can have rare conditions like amyloidosis, which you can only see on a biopsy, which present with vocal cord palsy. When we are done, we have seen from the medulla, jugular fossa, carotids, tracheoesophageal groove, then local causes in the larynx. Then there can be some miscellaneous causes like trauma or iatrogenic. So this recent history of surgery. So what do you see? The right half of the tongue, medial margin is sharp. So that is 12th vocal cord. There is edema in the right side of the true vocal cord with medially positioned aryepiglottic fold and dilated pyriform sinus. So these are 12th and 10th vocal cord palsy post iatrogenic post surgery. So when you're looking at post-operative patient with, you can see in cases of some cardiac surgeries, in thyroid surgeries, in central venous line catheterization, surgery on the cervical spine with anterior approaches, all these can cause vocal cord palsies. Then we move on to the mediastinum. What is Ortner syndrome? Ortner syndrome is hoarseness due to recurrent laryngeal nerve involvement due to a cardiovascular disease. So the palsies are there on the left side. Till now you must be knowing all the signs as well. I hope you all remember. So while imaging, I told you have to go right up to the superior mediastinum. So there's an aneurysm arising from the left arch of aorta. So this is along the course because the left recurrent laryngeal nerve goes around it and then ascends superiorly. So it is causing compression and causing the left side palsy. Another case of left-sided vocal cord palsy, there's a aneurysmal dilatation of arch and proximal descending thoracic aorta with dissection and thrombus. And this is causing palsy on the left side. This is a pulmonary angiogram. This patient has a history of tuberculosis, dilated pulmonary artery, which is compressing the recurrent laryngeal nerve and causing the palsy. You can see cases of after the mediastinal causes, the lung causes, left-sided vocal cord palsy with a mass in the lung with lymph nodes and causing the palsy. If there is a mass or a node in the aortopulmonary window or around the aorta that can involve the recurrent laryngeal nerve, that's what I told you. The left side is more commonly involved than the right side. Another case, a mass with nodes, lung mass with nodes in the aortopulmonary window causing the left-sided vocal cord palsy. So this you have to remember on a PET CT, you see there's a lesion showing increased uptake on the left side, but on the PET CT, you see increased uptake of the right vocal cord. Why does this happen? Why? Because there is increased metabolism in the normal cord due to hypertrophy. And this is not to be mistaken for malignancy. The ipsilateral side vocal cord shows atrophy. The opposite side shows compensatory hypertrophy and can show increased uptake on PET CT, which is not to be mistaken for malignancy. Then there are certain other causes for vocal cord. This mimics, you have to remember, post-intubation. It can injure the arytenoid cartilage, which is medially positioned, which can make a vocal cord palsy, or you do an imaging in oblique plane, which can mimic an enlarged ventricle. You have to know any treatment given to the patient, like some hydroxyapatite injection, etc., which can also give you a false impression of a vocal cord palsy. This is injection on the right side, but there is thickening of the left vocal cord on the left side. First there was a tumor on the right side, then the patient came with the left side vocal cord palsy. But this is just how a hydroxyapatite injection looks. So you have to know all these mimics. So I'd like to conclude that look for the signs of vocal cord palsy. There are some direct, there are some indirect signs. Carefully assess the entire course of the vagus and its branches to look for the cause of vocal cord palsy. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. That was a very elaborate discussion of the various causes, the pathologies leading to hoarseness. We have a couple of questions, ma'am, for you from the audience. Yeah, so the first one is, someone wants to know the causes of hoarseness once again. So ma'am, kindly repeat the causes of hoarseness. This is what he's written. So just an overview of what all can be the causes.
Yeah, so one is you go 50% are idiopathic, then you can have infarcts in the medulla, then the jugular fossa lesions, which I've shown some examples, then the lesion involving the vagus nerve in the carotid space, or because of the compression. Then you have laryngeal causes, which are the local causes, and mostly it is masses, or you can have a polyp. And then you can have lesions in the tracheoesophageal group, which can come from either thyroid, or it can come from parathyroid, or you can have nodes. And then finally, the mediastinal and lung causes.
Right.
Which,
right. So there's another question. Do we see indirect signs of vocal cord palsy even in local causes related to the vocal cord?
No, you don't see. Like if you have, so hoarseness, that is because of the local cause. So only if it goes in the areas of trachea, you have a node there or setting, then only it will cause involving the recurrent laryngeal nerve or the vagus, then only it will show the indirect sign, not because of the larynx masses.
Right now. So this was all that we had, the questions from the audience. So I had just one personal question. So have you ever tried to image the vagus nerve in entirety in the neck? Have you tried some kind of sequences so that you can actually see the nerve and its course and not just...
Yeah, I've tried the high resolution on MRI, but not been successful because we have 1.5 Tesla in our hospital. So maybe, but there are a lot of articles which are showing, especially in the upper neck.
Right. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Thank you. So with this, we move on to the next lecture of the day. And it's a pleasure to invite Dr. Naveen for the second lecture. He's an assistant professor at the Sri Chitra Tirunal Institute of Medical Sciences and Technology. And the topic of the day will be imaging of suprahyoid neck. So welcome, Dr. Naveen. And it is, over to you. You can take over from here.
Good evening. Am I audible?
Yeah, perfect.
I cannot able to share screen. I think madam has to exit.
Yeah, Kanika ma'am, you will have to unshare the screen. Thank you.
Is my screen visible?
Yeah, Naveen, perfect. You can go ahead.
First of all, I would like to thank ICRA for giving an opportunity to present the topic imaging in suprahyoid neck spaces. First of all, I will overview the talk. First, I will talk about the various imaging modalities which is commonly used to image the neck. And also, I will tell about the protocols which have to follow in cross-sectional imaging, followed by the anatomy of neck, the facial anatomy of neck. For the facial anatomy of the neck for division into various neck spaces is must for understanding understanding the imaging in neck. Next, I will talk about the contents and the pathologies of the neck. First of all, the plane radiograph. Usually, the lateral neck helps in visualization of the bony lesions such as the fractures, cervical spine abnormalities. We can also make out this airway spaces like compression of the airway, and it also helps in making out the soft tissue shadows. However, the radiograph is very poor in making out the soft tissue interfaces. In cases of fistulas and sinus tract, contrast can be injected to delineate the tract. The role of USG is it helps in visualizing the superficial lesions. Here we use a high frequency linear probe in visualization of the superficial lesions, such as in imaging of the parotid gland lesions and parotid gland, masticator space lesions and submandibular spaces. However, the lesions in the deep spaces like parapharyngeal spaces, pharyngeal mucosal spaces, and retropharyngeal spaces, it is very poor in imaging the deep spaces. This USG also helps to know the morphological characteristics of the lesions, such as the solid or cystic lesions, and also the and on Doppler we can see the vascularity. It also helps in evaluation of the vessels of the neck by carotid Doppler. Ultrasound is also used for guiding the biopsies and FNACs. Cross-sectional imaging like CT and MRI is the modality of choice while evaluating the lesions of the neck. It helps to know the entire extent of the lesions, various morphological characteristics of the lesions. It also helps in knowing the intracranial extension and intraspinal extension of the lesions. We can use the contrast study to depict the morphological characteristics, and also we can study that in multiplanar projection to demonstrate the extension. First of all, a brief about the CT imaging protocol. The positioning is the patient should be positioned in a supine position in hyperextended neck with both arms next to the body with the shoulders tugged downwards. It is planned in a lateral scanogram from the base of the skull to the thoracic inlet, and the plane should be parallel to the lower edge of the mandible. You can use IV contrast if needed. There are two protocols: the monophasic protocol, biphasic protocol. In monophasic protocol, usually the 70 to 100 ml of contrast is injected at a rate of 2 to 3 ml per second, with the imaging done at approximately 40 to 50 second delay. Whereas in biphasic injection, it is recommended if you want to see the vascular phase of the lesion as well as the parenchymal phase of the lesion. In this, the contrast dose is divided. 100 ml of contrast can be divided into 60 ml and 40 ml. First, the 60 ml of contrast is injected at the rate of 2 ml per second, followed by 60-second delay with 40 ml of contrast injected at 2 to 3 ml per second with a saline chaser, and the imaging can be done after further 10 to 20-second delay. So this biphasic will help in knowing both the vascular phase as well as the parenchymal phase. Later, the recon with soft tissue and bone window can be done depending upon the structure we want to visualize. And multiplanar projections and reconstructions can be done. Various dynamic manuals are recommended to delineate the mucosal lesions, such as in case of a gingival and buccal lesions, where the lesions will be approximating with the adjacent structures. It's very difficult to make out like the buccal cancer and gingival cancer, where the puffed cheek can be used. The other dynamic manuals like modified valsalva valve phonation, where the E is phonated for about 10 seconds. These are done mainly to produce a contrast of the mucosal surface with the air. So we can see the regions such as the hypopharynx and ventricles and the piriform sinuses can be better delineated in this dynamic manuals. Open mouth technique is used when there is a lot of artifacts due to implants, dental implants. Regarding the MRI protocol, the patient lies in the supine position with the head and neck coil placed, and adequate padding should be provided around the neck. The patient should be advised not to swallow during the scan to prevent the motion artifacts and asked to have a quiet breathing. Usually the 4 mm thickness is taken for MRI neck. The routine basic sequences like T1, T2 and post-contrast sequences are done. And fat suppression sequences like stir or spectral fat saturation can be done. Usually for neck, because of the sudden change in the curvature at the junction of the thorax and neck, there will be incomplete saturation if you use fat saturation techniques. So the usually coronal stir is recommended as it causes the global suppression of the fat. Then the post-contrast can be sequences, the fat suppression sequences can be taken in all the 3 planes, which helps in describing the extent of the lesion. Diffusion weighted sequence can be used, and additional sequences depending upon the lesion, like 3DCs if there is an intracranial extension with nerve involvement, and other if there is a vascular lesions, MR angiography if these tricks can be done. And whenever we plan for an MRI, if the it is not like that we should cover the entire neck from the base of the skull to the thorax. If the lesion is in the lesion is in the parapharyngeal space, which can be seen on a initial scan, or if the patient initially had a CT scan, if you know the lesion, then the lesion, then the center of the lesion. Then the scan center of the lesion is placed to the center of the scan so that we can know the intracranial extension of the lesion. If we only scan the base of skull to the thoracic inlet, then we may miss the intracranial extension. However, if there is any head and neck cancer, then we have to image the entire neck to know the lymph nodal pathologies. First, to talk about the boundaries of the neck. Neck is a tube which connects the head to the thorax with a lot of vital structures like aerodigestive tract compact within it. Superiorly, its superior extension, or anteriorly it is attached, it extends from the inferior margin of the mandible. Posteriorly, it extends up to the skull base. Inferiorly, inferior margins are the suprasternal notch along the clavicle, acromion, and the spine, C7 spine process. These are the superior and inferior boundaries. It can be divided into suprahyoid neck and infrahyoid neck. Suprahyoid neck extends from skull base to the hyoid bone. Infrahyoid neck extends from the hyoid to the thoracic inlet. Neck spaces can be broadly classified into suprahyoid and infrahyoid. This suprahyoid neck, there are few neck spaces are restricted only to the suprahyoid neck, like the pharyngeal mucosal space, parapharyngeal space, masticator space, and parotid space. Whereas other spaces is common for both the suprahyoid and infrahyoid, such as the carotid space, which is a paired space, whereas the midline spaces which extend both in a suprahyoid and infrahyoid neck are the petropharyngeal space, danger space, and the prevertebral space. Posterior cervical space also extends from the suprahiatal to infrahiatal region. These are the what is the need to divide the neck into spaces? For the better communication between the radiologist and the treating physician, it helps in diagnosis as each space has a specific pathologies. The cervical fascia it supports the internal structures of the neck by helping it to by dividing the neck into various compartments. The cervical fascia can be divided into superficial fascia and the deep fascia. Deep fascia is further divided into superficial, middle, and deep. The superficial cervical fascia. This is the superficial cervical fascia encases the subcutaneous fat, platysma muscle, subcutaneous veins, nerves, and lymphatics, which are represented by the green color. Deep cervical fascia is again divided into 3 layers. The superficial, which is called as the investing layer, the middle layer, which is the pretracheal layer, and the deep layer is the prevertebral layer. The superficial layer is also called as the investing layer. It encases completely encircles the neck, encasing the sternocleidomastoid muscle and trapezius muscle. These are the 2 muscles it encases, and it also encases the 2 glands, that is the parotid gland and submandibular gland. The extension of the superficial fascia is same as that of the neck. The superficial layer of the deep cervical fascia splits between the angle of mandible and mastoid process to enclose the parotid gland, and in the submandibular space it splits to enclose the submandibular gland. The spaces which is formed by superficial fascia, superficial investing layer is the masticator space, the parotid space, submandibular space, and suprasternal space of Burns. Next, coming to middle layer of the deep cervical fascia, which is also called as the pretracheal fascia. It is divided into muscular division and visceral division. Muscular division encases the strap muscles of the neck, which is not that much important. Visceral division is very important as it encases the vital structures like aerodigestive tract, that is and also the thyroid gland, trachea, and esophagus. The visceral fascia in the suprahyoid neck is called as the pharyngobasilar and buccopharyngeal fascia. This is the visceral fascia, which encloses the thyroid gland. And the posterior part of the visceral fascia, this is called as the buccopharyngeal fascia, whereas the submucosal part of the visceral fascia is called as the pharyngobasilar fascia. And it spans from the skull base to the thorax, fusing with the pericardium. See, the posterior aspect of the visceral fascia is the buccopharyngeal fascia. This buccopharyngeal fascia separates the pharyngeal mucosal space from the retropharyngeal space posteriorly, and laterally this buccopharyngeal fascia separates the pharyngeal mucosal space from the parapharyngeal space. The middle or the visceral layer encloses the pharyngeal mucosal space and the visceral space, parapharyngeal space. It forms the anterior wall of the retropharyngeal space. Coming to deep layer of the deep cervical fascia, it surrounds the vertebral column as well as the deep muscles of the neck. It has 2 layers, that is the alar layer and the prevertebral layer. The danger space of the neck lies between this alar layer and the prevertebral layer. And the spaces enclosed by deep cervical fascia are perivertebral space, which is further divided into prevertebral and paraspinal space, and danger space, and it also forms the posterior wall of the retropharyngeal space. This is the retropharyngeal space, which is seen between the buccopharyngeal fascia and the alar fascia. This is the danger space, which is seen between the alar fascia and the prevertebral fascia. First, you should know how to approach a neck pathology. So, the common protocol we should follow while approaching the lesion is first identify the space. After identify the face, recall the normal anatomical contents. Once you know about the anatomic contents, you can know all the pathologies, DDs related with those anatomical contents, and you can pattern based on the radiological appearance of the lesions, and you should integrate with the clinical information, such as an aggressive lesion in an nasopharynx in a young patient, in a child, is more probably it appears to be a rhabdomyosarcoma rather than a nasopharyngeal carcinoma, which is seen in an elderly patient. So we should also know the clinical picture of the patient before approaching the imaging part. Coming to suprahyoid neck spaces, First, we'll deal with the pharyngeal mucosal space. It's a continuous mucosal muscular sheet extending from the base of the skull up to the cricoid cartilage. Below it is continuous as a esophagus. It is divided into nasopharynx, oropharynx, and hypopharynx. The level of the palate divides the pharynx into nasopharynx and oropharynx. The tip of the epiglottis divides into oropharynx and hypopharynx. The contents are the mucosa, the muscles, lymphatics, that's the Waldear's lymph, and minor salivary glands. This yellow line depicts the outer border of the pharyngeal mucosal space. Laterally, there is a parapharyngeal space. This is the parapharyngeal space. And on the lateral nasopharyngeal wall, we can see the two recesses and one protrusion. The protrusion is the torus tubaris. This is the torus tubaris. This is the cartilaginous projection of the eustachian tube. Lateral to it, we can see the eustachian tube. And posterior or superior to the torus tubaris, we can see a recess called as fossa of Rosenmuller. The contents and the corresponding pathologies. Pharyngeal mucosa, urethral to squamous cell carcinoma, Waldear's lymph, which gives to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Minor salivary glands can give neoplasms, most commonly the mucoepidermal carcinomas. Muscular muscles can give rise to rhabdomyosarcomas. Other miscellaneous like juvenile nasopharyngeal angiofibroma and Thorn-Wall cyst can be seen in the pharyngeal mucosal space. We should also know the skull-base interactions. This pharyngeal mucosal space abuts the sphenoid sinuses and the anterior clival margin, and it is related to foramen lacerum. So the lesions like nasopharyngeal carcinoma can easily spread perivascularly along the ICA into the internal intracranially. And it is also, this nasopharyngeal carcinoma can also spread to petroclival fissure. This is the carotid space, which is in close relation with the carotid artery and the IJV. This is the masticator space, which is in relation with the foramen ovale and spinosum. So we should note the skull-base foramina with the corresponding spaces. This is a lesion within the pharyngeal mucosal space, which is causing the displacement of the parapharyngeal fat laterally, posterolaterally, and it usually the lesions projects into the pharynx. Let's see the few examples in the lesions in the pharyngeal mucosal space. Here is a 65-year-old male who has a history of cigarette smoking and alcohol consumption, presenting with dysphagia. Axial sections of the CT. Here we can see a exophytic mass lesion arising from the right lateral postopharyngeal wall, which is crossing the midline. And we can see a conglomerated heterogeneously enhancing lymph nodal mass within the right level 2 lesion. And we can also see a filling defect within the IJV. So this is a case of a oropharyngeal squamous cell carcinoma. Another patient is a 65-year-old female with difficulty in swallowing. Here, what we can see is the homogeneously enhancing mass lesion in the right lateral wall of the pharynx, which is extending into the tonsillar fossa region, into the soft palate region, and along the walls, right lateral pharynx. It is abutting the tongue with effacement of the vallecula. This is a homogeneously enhancing mass with no cystic areas or no calcification. So it appears to be, the first DD appears to be a non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So it appears to be non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Next, this is 7-year-old female patient presenting with headaches in 7 weeks. Headaches in 2 weeks. Here we can see axial sections of the T2 shows a heterogeneously hyperintense mass lesion within the right lateral wall of the nasopharynx. If you continuously trace it, it is extending, it is encasing the petrous part of the ICA, cavernous part of the ICA with intracranial extension. You can see the destruction of the bone base of the skull. You can also see the hyperintensity within the mastoid airspace as well as the tympanic cavity, which is due to the obstruction by the mass lesion. This is the 3D sequence, and this one is the T1 coronal T1 sequence, where we can see the fat, parapharyngeal fat, which is displaced laterally. On a post-contrast sequence, it shows heterogeneous enhancement with the internal necrotic areas can be seen. So the young patient with such a malignant lesion with bony destructions, we can see the bony destruction, and so it appears to be the most probable diagnosis is rhabdomyosarcoma with serous otitis media and masturbatis. This is a spotter. We can see a T1, T2 hyperintense cystic lesions in the midline, in the nasopharynx region, which is hyperintense even flare and mildly hyperintense on T1. This is a Thorne-Mott cyst, which is a mucosal retention cyst, which is an incidental finding. However, if the size is large, it can cause the serous otitis media due to obstruction. It is usually a leave-alone lesion, no need of surgically remove it. As a 17-year-old male patient presenting with recurrent epistaxis. This is the CECT of the neck. What we can see is a heterogeneously enhancing large mass lesion involving the nasopharynx, which is extending into the right nasal cavity and through the pterygopalatine fissure, it is extending into the infratemporal fossa region. It is causing thinning of the adjacent bones. The posterior wall of the right maxilla sinus is displaced anteriorly, which is called as the antral sign. This is a case of a nasopharyngeal angiofibroma. What we can see in MRI is the T2 hyperintense lesion, which is showing intense enhancement. This is a highly vascular lesion. And here in the coronal section, we can see extension of the lesion into the infratemporal fossa through the pterygomaxillary fissure. Here, the DSA has been done, which shows multiple feeders from the sphenoparental artery, sphenic pharyngeal artery. It usually have a vascular supply from the ECA feeders. Rarely, it can also have vascular supply from the cavernous and petrous segment of the ICA. So, in an adolescent patient, such a vascular mass, think of a juvenile nasopharyngeal angiofibroma. So, second, moving to the parapharyngeal space, it's a paired centrally fat-filled spaces. It appears as an inverted pyramid on coronal sections. It extends from the skull base superiorly up to the margin of the up to the level of the hyoid bone. It ends, and the infection tumor from the adjacent spaces can easily spread to parapharyngeal spaces. The main contents of the parapharyngeal space is the fat, and the corresponding pathology is the lipoma. It can also have minor salivary glands and a retromandibular portion of the parotid gland. In some definition, they will call the retromandibular portion of the that is the deep lobe of the parotid gland to be in the parapharyngeal place, but in reality, it is a part of a parotid space. So it can give rise to salivary gland tumors. The nerve, that is the mandibular division, which will give rise to the nerve sheath tumors, let's say the schwannoma, neurofibroma, and vessels, which is the internal maxillary artery, ascending pharyngeal artery, and pterygoid plexus can be seen. And here, this is the Ibsen CT showing the anatomy of the parapharyngeal space, which appears as a dark signal due to fat. Anteriorly, it is related with the masticator space. Medially, this is the pharyngeal mucosal space. Laterally, posterolaterally, it is related to parotid space, and posteriorly, it is related to carotid space. Earlier, surgeons used to classify this as this parapharyngeal space as a pre-styloid parapharyngeal space and carotid space as post-styloid parapharyngeal space. But Hasberg and Osborne, they have classified as they have segregated this as a separate entity, classifying. They have not divided based on this pre-styloid and post-styloid. They have called a carotid space as a separate space. So this is the MRI, which shows the T1 hyperintense parapharyngeal fat region. And the main importance of the parapharyngeal space is it helps in localizing the lesion. When there is a very large lesion, it's very difficult to localize the lesion where the exact epicenter is. So in these cases, we can look at the displacement of the parapharyngeal space, such as in pharyngeal mucosal space lesions, will displace the parapharyngeal space laterally. Here, the masticator space lesion, which displaces the parapharyngeal space posteriorly and medially, whereas the parotid space lesion will displace the parapharyngeal space anteromedially. and the carotid space lesion will displace it anterior. Let's see a few examples. This is a large T2 hyperintense, well-lobulated lesion seen within the parapharyngeal space with multiple T2 hyperintense areas within. And in the coronal T1 section, we can see a thin strip of fat around the surrounding the entire lesion, suggesting that this is a parapharyngeal space. And a post-contrast study shows internal necrotic areas. So such a well-lobulated lesion with necrotic areas, encapsulated lesion within the parapharyngeal space, the first TD appears to be the schwannoma of the mandibular division. Next, the 65-year-old male patient presenting with dysphagia and dyspnea. Here, the non-contact CT, which shows a T2 well-defined lobulated hypodense lesion within the parapharyngeal, parapharyngeal space. Here, we can see a thin strip of fat both on the anterior and the posterior aspect of the mass lesion. And again, the post-contrast study, it shows a heterogeneous enhancement. Here, we can see a small stalk communicating with the parotid gland through the widening of the stylomandibular tunnel. So this is actually a case of a pleomorphic adenoma from the deep lobe of the parotid gland. Here in the coronal section multiplan, we can better see the splaying of the parapharyngeal fat. So actually, this is a deep lobe lesion, which is mimicking a parapharyngeal mass lesion. So few people they consider this deep lobe as a part of parapharyngeal space. This is a 77-year-old male patient presenting with the painless enlarging lump on the right side of the neck since 7 years. Otherwise, he is symptomatic. Here we can see axial T1 sections of the neck shows a intensely hyperintense lesion, which is seen in the parapharyngeal space, which is extending retromandibularly to the parotid space. This is a case of a lipoma, on the parapharyngeal lipoma. Masticator space lesion. It is the largest suprahyoid neck space. It is enveloped by superficial layer of the deep cervical fascia. Its extent is from skull base inferiorly up to the mandible, lower part of the mandible. It is anteriorly, it is related to the buccal base. Posteriorly, it is related to the posterior medially, it is related to parapharyngeal fat, and posterolaterally, it is related to the parotid space. And it can be divided by the zygomatic arch into suprazygomatic, infrazygomatic. Suprazygomatic is also called temporal fossa. Infrazygomatic is also called as infratemporal fossa. And the contents of the masticator space are the muscles of the mastication, that is the medial and lateral pterygoid, masseter muscle, and the temporalis muscle, and the ramus of the body of the mandible, and the mandibular division of the trigeminal. We can see here the mandibular division of the trigeminal in between the pterygoid muscles of mastication. This is the axial sections of the CT, where we can see this medial pterygoid. This is the masseter muscle. This is the ramus of the mandible. Here on the axial T1 sections of the neck, we can see the medial and lateral pterygoid. This is the ramus of the mandible. This is the masseter muscle. The pathologies in masseter muscle are muscle can give rise to masseter muscle hypertrophy or rhabdomyosarcoma. The mandible can give rise to various tumors of the bone and inflammatory pathologies of the bone, which is the most common, like the odontogenic abscess and osteomyelitis, and various dentagerous cysts arising from the mandible. The mandibular division can give rise to schwannoma and neurofibroma, and vascular pathologies like hemangioma and vascular malformation can be seen. But the most common pathology is the odontogenic infections. Here, there is a 40-year-old male patient with an asymmetry of the face. We can with a swelling, presenting with swelling in the left side of the neck. What we can see is an enlarged masseter muscle compared to the contralateral side. We can see the asymmetry, and in the temporalis region, we can see the increased thickness of the temporalis muscle. This is the coronal T1 weighted MRI, which shows the hypertrophy of the temporalis muscle as well as the masseteric muscle. And on post-contrast study, we can see the uniform enhancement of the muscle. This is not a lesion, separate lesion. It's just a hypertrophy of the muscle. This is the left masseter and temporalis muscle hypertrophy. Another patient is a 25-year-old male patient after wisdom tooth extraction presented with fever, trismus, and left-sided jaw pain. Here, orthopantomogram here which shows that here the tooth socket is blurred, and on the CT bone window we can see the loss of the tooth. And on the axial sections, of the mesenteric space, at the level of the mesenteric space, we can see the multiple hypodense areas which is seen in the mesenteric muscle as well as the pterygoid muscle with expansion. And in the parapharyngeal space, we can also see the fatty stranding suggestive of inflammation extending to the parapharyngeal space. So this is a case of a masticator space abscess secondary to tooth extraction. It's a 40-year-old female patient presenting with right-sided facial pain and numbness. This is the axial T2 sections. Serial section, we can see a T2 hyperintense cystic lesion extending from the paracavernous region inferiorly into the mesenteric space region. This is the between the muscles of mastication. This is the pterygoid, between the pterygoid muscles. This is the conal section. We can see the widening of the bone, the scalloping of the bone here, extending from the paracavernous region to the masticator space regions with playing of the muscles. This is the post-contrast sequence, which shows the cystic necrotic areas on the same depicting the extension. And on the CT, it shows a well scalloped margins. There is no distraction with widening of the foramen ovale. So this is a case of a mandibular division trigeminal schwannoma. A 22-year-old female presenting with the right. What we can see is a multi-compartmental lesion involving the parotid space, masticator space within the muscles as well as the subcutaneous plane. There are multiple T2 hyperintense vascular spaces. We can also see the fluid levels in these lesions. This is the post-contrast study, which shows the pooling of contrast within these venous spaces enhancement, showing the intense enhancement. And on the CT, we can see the phleboliths. This multiple compartmental lesion is a slow flow vascular malformation. Next, this masticator space is in closely abuts the foramen ovale. So the lesion of the masticator space extends intracranially, causing widening of this foramen ovale. It's called the perineurous plate. Next, coming to parotid space, it is enclosed by the superficial layer of the deep cervical fascia. It extends from the mastoid tip superiorly to the angle of the mandible inferiorly. Its contents of the parotid gland, facial nerve, external carotid artery, retromandibular vein, and the lymph nodes. The facial nerve divides the parotid gland into superficial lobe and inferior and deep lobe. However, radiologically, it's very difficult to see the facial nerve. Only in few patients on coronal T1 facial nerve can be seen. So, radiologically, we consider the retromandibular vein to divide the parotid into superficial and deep lobe. And facial palsy associated with the parotid lesion suggests to be a malignant lesion with the perineurous spread. Here we can see extending along the facial. This is the deep lobe of the parotid gland lesion, which is causing the widening of the stylomandibular tunnel with displacement of the parapharyngeal fat anteromedially. The various pathologies of the parotid lesion are the benign tumors like pleomorphic adenoma, Warthin's tumor, malignant tumors like mucoepidermal carcinoma. Inflammatory pathologies are the most common, which can be sialadenitis, parotitis, abscess, reactive lymph nodes. In children, parotid lesion can also be hemangioma. Other lesions, miscellaneous lesions, are like calculi, lymphoepithelial lesions associated with AIDS, Sjogren syndrome, brachial cleft, first brachial cleft cyst, and the schwannoma, rarely schwannoma. Parotid space has already been discussed. It's a separate talk, so I'm skipping all the lesions, all the cases. Next, more to the carotid space. It's a peritubular space, which is seen both in supraortic neck as well as the infraortic neck. It is made up of all the three layers of the deep layer, deep cervical fascia. That is, it is formed by investing layer, middle layer, as well as the prevertebral layer. The contents of the carotid space are in the supraortic neck. It is mainly formed by the ICA, IJV, and the 9 to 12 cranial nerve, sympathetic chain, along with lymph node. In infraortic neck, the contents are the vagus nerve, sympathetic nerve, and the lymph node. The vagus nerve lies on the posterior aspect. The pathologies of the carotid space are most commonly the carotid body tumor or paraganglioma, or the schwannoma, neurofibroma of the vagus nerve or sympathetic chain, or the pseudoaneurysm of the ICA, and the lymphadenopathy such as a metastasis or Kesselman disease. This lymph node can enlarge in carotid space. This is a 45-year-old female patient. One second. Will share my screen again.
Yes.
Can you able to see my screen?
Yes, it's fine.
Here we can see an intensely enhancing lesion within the carotid space, which is causing the splaying of the both ICA and ECA with multiple hypertrophic feeder arterial feeders can be seen around this lesion. A small lesion can also be seen in the right side of the neck. Here again, sagittal, we can see the splaying of the ICA and ECA, which is called as the Lyre sign. Here. And on DSA, we can show the intense tumoral blush in the region of the carotid space, with spraying of the ECA and ICA. Usually, it is supplied by the multiple branches from the ECA and the deep cervical arteries and ascending cervical arteries. Usually, rarely, it can also supply feeders from the ICA. Here we can see the selective run of the ECA. And on the right side, we can see another lesion with intense vascular blush. This is the case of the carotid body tumor. So another patient with a history of an RTA, what we can see is a defect within the wall of the ICA with a large contrast field outpoaching seen, and the peripheral thrombus can be seen here. And on DSA, we can see the contrast extravasation suggestive of a pseudoaneurysm. These can be treated by a stent graft. If the collaterals are good, can also be treated by parent artery occlusions. The retropharyngeal space extends from the skull base to the mediastinum up to the T4 level. It's a midline fat filled space which is seen posterior to the pharynx and esophagus. Anteriorly, it is bounded by the buccopharyngeal fascia. Posteriorly, it is bounded by the visceral fascia. Posteriorly, it is bounded by the alar fascia. Contents of the retropharyngeal space are in the supraaortic, it contains the lymph nodes and fat, whereas in the infraord, it contains fat only. The main pathologies are the lipoma, lymph nodes, and the infection of the retropharyngeal space with pus and fluid in the retropharyngeal space. Metastatic lymph nodes can also be seen in the retropharyngeal spaces. There is a 55-year-old female patient with complaint of pain or swallowing following a fishbone injection 4 days earlier. The patient is also a known case by diabetic. Here on the lateral radiograph, we can see the increase in the thickness of the this retropharyngeal shadow, soft tissue shadow, with multiple air bubbles can be seen within it. Normally, at the C2 level, the thickness should be 7 mm, and at the C6 level, it should be 14 mm for children and 22 mm for adults. It is way larger than that, displacing the airway anteriorly. And on the CT, say contrastional CT, we can see the peripherally enhancing capsule with the central non-enhancing area, and multiple air loculi can be seen, suggesting of fluid collection within the retropharyngeal space. This is a case of retropharyngeal abscess. These are very life-threatening and dangerous and needs urgent evacuation. Next is the dangerous space of the neck, which is located behind the retropharyngeal space between the alar fascia and prevertebral fascia. It stands from the skull base to the mediastinum, which is extending up to the diaphragm. And it is the potential space for spread of infection from the deep space of the neck into the mediastinum. What the difference between the retropharyngeal spaces? The retropharyngeal space ends at the T4 level, whereas the this one dangerous space extends up to the level of the diaphragm. However, radiologically, it's very difficult to differentiate between the retropharyngeal space collection as well as the dangerous space collection. Perivertebral space, it extends from the skull base to the coccyx, encasing the entire vertebral column. It is surrounded by a deep layer of the deep cervical fascia. It is subdivided into prevertebral space and paraspinal space. The prevertebral space encases this vertebral body and this prevertebral muscles like longus colli and scalenus muscles. And it encases the vertebral artery and vein and the two nerves, that is the phrenic nerve and brachial plexus. Paraspinal space encloses the posterior elements of the vertebrae as well as the paraspinal muscles as its contents. The pathologies seen in perivertebral spaces are the pathologies of the spine, such as the osteomyelitis, degenerative, and tumors, metastasis, aneurysmal bone cysts, and pathologies of the nerves, such as the schwannoma and neurofibroma, and various malignant lesions, such as vertebral body mets, chordoma, which is, and lesions from the vessels, such as the vertebral artery dissection or vertebral artery pseudoaneurysm. These are the common pathologies which are seen in perivertebral space. This is a spotter. Here we can see a T2 hyperintense collection in the prevertebral space. We can see the destruction of the C3 and C4 vertebral body along with the intervertebral disc. This collection is spreading in the subligamentum. Spread of the collection is seen, which is restricted by the prevertebral fascia. And posterior, there is subluxation of the vertebra with compression of the underlying cord. So this is a case of a cord spine with prevertebral cold abscess. This is another case where we can see a dumbbell-shaped lesion, hyperdense lesion, which is seen in the spinal canal as well as extending into the prevertebral space through the neural foramina, causing its widening. Here we can see this scalloping of the bone vertebrae. There is no destruction is seen. Only the scalloping and thinning of the vertebral body can be seen. And on this is the T1 section, which shows hypointense lesion with multiple hyperintense areas within. On T2, it shows predominantly appears hypointense. And on post-contrast study shows heterogeneous enhancement. So this is a case of a neurofibroma with the hemorrhagic content within. So then coming to without neck spaces, while discussing the neck spaces, we have to discuss about the lymph nodal levels of the neck. However, the lymph node levels of the neck is better covered in the intra-aortic neck. So I'm just I will brief about this lymph nodal levels. You should know about the various lymphatic drainage pathways of the normal structures. So we can localize the pathologies because most of the aerodigestive tract lesions present as initially as a metastatic lymph nodal mass with occult primary lesion. So if you know the drainage pathway, if you can look into these spaces. And again, this lymph nodes are classified based on the this is a surgical classification actually, not based on the neck spaces. However, this is been followed by radiologists as it is helpful for the surgeons. This classification is based on the neck dissection, like modified radical dissection, where they remove all these lymph nodes. However, in this classification, retropharyngeal, parotid lymph nodes, and other parapharyngeal lymph nodes, these are all not involved because these are the deep spaces of the neck, which are not usually removed during the neck dissections. So usually this cervical lymph node staging is done based on the American Joint Committee for Cancer of Head and Neck 8th edition, and it has based on the certain features of the lymph node and lymph nodes. The radiological features which helps in diagnosing that whether it's a metastatic or reactive lymph nodes is that usually this metastatic lymph nodes they have an extranodal extension which can appear as a enhancement irregular border surrounding the outer border of the lymph nodes extending to the adjacent structures. They can show the necrosis or cystic areas, and usually they are rounder in shape where we can measure the long axis to short axis ratio. And usually pathological lymph nodes are considered pathological if there are more than 10 mm. For jugular-digastric and submandibular lymph nodes, the usual cutoff taken is the 1.5 centimeter. This malignant metastatic lymph nodes appears intense on PET scan with the increased uptake of FDG. Finally, summarizing the neck spaces, here the red space is the masticator space with including with contents as the muscles of mastication, ramus of the mandible with the mandibular nerve. This is the parapharyngeal. Green is the parapharyngeal space with the main content as the parapharyngeal fat. This is the pharyngeal mucosal space. This pink one is the retropharyngeal space. This is the green one is the parotid space. And the perivertebral space is again divided into prevertebral space and the paraspinal space, covering the paraspinal nerves. In conclusion, this describing these neck spaces helps in better communication between the radiologist and treating physician. Understanding the facial anatomy of the neck spaces, facial anatomy and neck spaces helps in diagnosis, as each space has a specific pathology. Always remember to follow a systemic approach. First, identify a space, then recall the normal anatomical contents, and finally, based on the correlation with the clinical and radiological features, we can short down the differential diagnosis. This is a woman from a tribe from Myanmar and Thailand, where they wear these brass necklaces, neck rings, starting at the age of 5 years. See, what it can do is this is actually a illusion for elongating the having a long neck. In reality, this is just an illusion, because it is basically pushing the clavicle and all the ribs inferiorly, and it cause various it can cause various health hazards, even causing the neuro compression of the various nerves, difficulty in respiration. All these things can happen. Can I move down with please?
Yeah, please go ahead with the quiz.
Just answer it as a true or false. The fascia of the neck, all the muscles of the neck are deep to the investing layer of the deep fascia. The carotid sheath is derived from all the 3 layers of deep fascia. The visceral layer encloses the thyroid cartilage. The prevertebral fascia extends to superior mediastinum. The parotid gland is surrounded by the investing layer of the deep cervical fascia. May I know the answer?
Yeah, so let us give some time to the audience. And team doctor, you can just...
Yes, sir. We have to wait for some time, sir.
Yes, maybe around 20 seconds.
Sure, sir. Naveen, sir, I'm posting the answers in the chat. Are you able to see them, sir?
No.
Yeah, I mean,
yes,
so
yes.
it says-
Yes, I'm able to see them.
Yes.
So most of them say
Oh.
false, true, true.
False, true, okay.
So you can just
Next one is false, correct. All the muscles of the neck are deep to the investing layer of the deep cervix. These are false, because sternocleidomastoid, platysma muscle is superficial to the investing layer of the deep fascia. Yes, the carotid sheath is derived from all the 3 layers of the deep fascia. That is the investing layer, middle layer, as well as the prevertebral fascia. Yes. The visceral layer encloses the thyroid cartilage. The prevertebral fascia extend into the superior mediastinum. Yes, but prevertebral fascia still extends up to the coccyx. So it's a false. Parotid gland is surrounded by investing layer of the deep cervical fascia. This is true. Moving to the next question. Which of the following structures lies in the parapharyngeal space? Internal carotid artery, hypoglossal nerve, maxillary artery, lingual tonsil, vagus nerve.
Okay, so do we have answers? Yeah, Team with Auto, I hope the poll is live.
No, all are true. This is wrong. Not.
No, sir, actually, most of them answered D and C.
Okay, D and C.
Yes, sir.
C is right. Lingual tonsil is not a part of pharyngeal space, parapharyngeal space. Intercarotid artery is a part of carotid space. Maxillary artery is the correct answer. Vagus is again a part of the carotid space. So maxillary artery is the right answer. C.
Right.
On to third question. What are the contents of the pharyngeal mucosal space? This is a multiple choice. There are multiple answers. A is the pharyngobasilar fascia. B, ascending pharyngeal artery. C, pharyngeal venous plexus. D, pharyngeal constrictors. And E, the adenoid and tonsil.
Naveen, sir, are you able to see the answer, sir?
Yes. A, B, C, D, all are true, false. This
No, all are true is the name, sir. Actually, they have named themselves as all are true and they are answering them.
Okay. No. Pharyngobasilar fascia is a part of pharyngeal mucosal space. Ascending pharyngeal artery and pterygoid, that is pharyngeal venous plexus, are a part of parapharyngeal fat space. Pharyngeal constrictors, adenoid, and tonsils are again the contents of pharyngeal mucosal space. So the answer is A, D, E. This ascending pharyngeal and pharyngeal venous plexus are not the part of pharyngeal mucosal space. True or false? Regarding pharynx, here the pharynx has 6 group of muscles. The pharyngobasilar fascia is a continuous sheath which forms the superior portion of the pharynx. The fossa of Rosenmuller is superior to torus tuberous in the coronal CT and MR images. The sinus of Morgagni is the site of origin of 50% of nasopharyngeal carcinoma. The epiglottis is the boundary between oropharynx and laryngopharynx.
Sir, I have posted the answers in the chat, sir.
False. Okay. You can check your answers. The pharynx has 6 group of muscles. This is false. The pharynx has 5 group of muscles. That is the superior, middle, inferior constrictor and 2 palatine muscles. That is levator, avale palate and tensor veli palate. So it's a 5 muscles. Pharyngobasilar fascia is a continuous sheath which forms the superficial portion of the pharynx. This is false. Pharyngobasilar fascia has a defect in the superior part, which is called as the sinus of Morgagni. See, this is the pharyngobasilar fascia, which has a defect, which is called as the sinus of Morgagni, through which the eustachian tube passes. This is also a site for spread of nasopharyngeal carcinoma through defect in this. So it is not a continuous sheath. Next, the fossa of Rosenmuller is superior to torus tuberous. This one, here we can see this is the ostium of the eustachian tube. This projection is the torus tuberous. So posteriorly and superiorly, there is the recess which is called as the fossa of Rosenmuller. This is the most common site for nasopharyngeal carcinoma. So this is right. Fossa of Rosenmuller is superior to the torus tuberous. Then sinus of Morgagni is the site of origin of 50% of the nasopharyngeal carcinoma. It is false. Most common site is the fossa of Rosenmuller. The epiglottis is the boundary between the oropharynx and larynx is true. And the palate is the boundary between the nasopharynx and the oropharynx. Next, fifth question, true or false? So, regarding nasopharyngeal carcinoma, asymmetry in the aeration of the fossa of Rosenmuller is a very sensitive but not a specific sign of cancer. Obliteration of the fat strip between tensor and levator palatine is highly sensitive. High signal in mastoids and middle ear can be seen. Adenoid should not measure more than 5 mm in adults. Enhancement of paravertebral muscles indicates involvement. Someone has answered true, false, true, false. Correct. First one is the true. The asymmetry in the aeration of fossa of Rosenmuller is a very sensitive sign, but not a specific sign of cancer. Then second one, it's again true. Obliteration of the fat stripe is also a highly sensitive sign. Third, it is also true. High signal in mastoid and middle ear can be seen because secondary to the obstruction of the eustachian tube. And fourth one, it is false. Yes, adenoids should not measure more than 5 mm. It is false. Should not measure more than 10 mm. Up to 10 mm can be considered normal in adults. Enhancement of the paravertebral muscles indicates involvement. That is true. So most of them have answered correct. This one. Many of them have answered correct. Next, move to the sixth question. The following techniques are helpful in evaluation of head and neck tumors. The puff cheek manure, or the Valsalva manure, or the phonation manure, or the deglutition. Which dynamic manure will help in better evaluation of head and neck tumors? Second, a multiple choice. So multiple answers can be right. Someone has posted A, B, C of cheek, B and C. The techniques, the dynamic maneuvers which are done for head and neck tumors are puff cheek and phonation. Valsalva is maneuver is not done. Actually, it's a modified Valsalva maneuver. Valsalva maneuver is an expiration through a closed glottis, whereas modified Valsalva is the expiration through a puff cheek. So modified Valsalva maneuver is done, not the Valsalva. So the correct answer is the puff cheek and the phonation. A and C are right. This concludes. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Naveen. It was wonderful. Actually, we did an elaborate discussion of all the pathologies involving the suprahead neck spaces. So there are a couple of questions before we say good night to you. So I'll start off with, how is the prevertebral space different from dangerous space of the neck?
Actually, the prevertebral fascia has two layers. One is the alar fascia and the other is the prevertebral layer. This alar fascia will ends at the level of diaphragm, whereas and the space between the alar fascia and the prevertebral fascia is called as the danger space, whereas behind the prevertebral fascia is the prevertebral space. So it extends up to the coccyx. So in dangerous space, actually, it's very difficult. We cannot make out in imaging wise.
Yeah, and this was the second question. Actually, you've already answered it. So the second question says, how to differentiate pathologies of the dangerous space versus pathologies of the prevertebral vis-a-vis the retropharyngeal space. Now, is it possible? Yeah.
Dangerous space, usually the pathologies are mainly the deep cervical infection can spread through this space into the mediastinum. Per se, the dangerous space will not have any contents, its own contents to have a separate. Prevertebral space pathologies have its own contents. It's mainly the danger spaces. It's extension of the infection or tumors from the other spaces.
Correct. And now one of the residents has rightly pointed out, and he says, is it possible to differentiate these spaces on MRI? If not, then what is the imaging importance, as these are potential spaces not well differentiated on imaging? And you've rightly and correctly answered that. So he's himself actually told that the dangerous space is a potential space, and there is a potential for the spread of infection from the surrounding areas into the dangerous space. And if this infection extends into the dangerous space, it can potentially enter the posterior mediastinum and involve all the structure of the posterior mediastinum. Thank you. So next question. In the case of deep lobe of parotid pleomorphic adenoma, how to make out if the hypodense lesion is cystic or solid on CT? And
hypodense lesion is
cystic or solid on CT. It looked cystic with septate. So basically, I think what
I showed.
Yes. That. So how to differentiate pure cystic lesion from a solid lesion with cystic lesion with septate?
Okay. Mainly on contrast CT, we can able to see the enhancing septase, whereas the cystic area will not enhance. So the cystic component can be seen, can be made out well in a contrast study.
Right. And another objective method is by actually measuring the Hounsfield value. So usually the cysts have a lower Hounsfield value, less than 10 or 20 HU. And if you are finding higher
high attenuation value.
Yes. Right. So posterior pharyngeal wall, please explain anatomy on CT and MRI. Posterior pharyngeal wall.
Posterior pharyngeal wall.
I think
mainly posterior pharyngeal wall, pharynx has a multiple layers. The first layer is the mucosa. Behind the mucosa is the submucosal fascia, which is called as the pharyngobasilar fascia. And behind this is the muscle layer, that is the superior, middle, and inferior constrictor muscle. Posterior to this is the fascia, which is the visceral fascia. On the suprahyoid part, it is thickened, which is called as the buccopharyngeal fascia. So basically, these are the layers of the pharynx. Posterior pharynx is mainly formed by the buccopharyngeal fascia. But another important thing is you have to also keep in mind that the pharyngobascular fascia has a defect in it to conduct this eustachian tube and the levator palatii muscles and all. So this is the potential site for spread of nasopharyngeal cancers.